So we talked about all the different levels of software suck and how it impacts an organization. Today we're going to dive in and say, well, why does it suck? If you remember, one of the first ones we talked about in the tier 1 of suck is that you've got a software application and you're only using a small part of it. So why is that? So when the software vendor first starts out, they start building something that's really niche and really cool, and it works for this much of the market. But as they start expanding, they start thinking, well, geez, if we add this functionality, maybe listening to some of their customers, and they're adding things onto it, that different pieces of functionality they're adding onto it for different customers, the software gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So they find their core customers, not all of them, starting to use a smaller and smaller percentage of what that software actually does, until they get to a point where they've added so much extra stuff on that they really lose sight of what their core mission, what their core piece of software is. So is it because the software developers are poor? No. It just means they're trying to expand their market outside of what they originally did really well. So that's why you're only using 10 to 15% of it, but you're buying all of it. So that's one of the biggest issues with software providers and software vendors today, and why you only find yourself using 10 to 15% of an application. So the rest of it is effectively bloatware, tying down and creating more confusion for users. And that sucks. All right, diving deeper again into why software sucks, let's talk about custom software. So when you're building custom software, you really got to start with a solid foundation, putting the system together, and really the user will only see the top part of it. So if you think of it like an iceberg, right? So you've got the part the user sees, and you've got all the stuff in the foundation underneath it. So what happens when we go through these types of development processes, if we're doing something like maybe a software development lifecycle waterfall where you do all your planning and everything up front, is that long time period, things change in the business. So we talked about maybe 18 months later, 6 months later, it's finished and it's to scope, it's to what you wanted to do, but it's not exactly what you need to do now because your business has been changing and adapting. The other side of it is the agile approach where you build kind of a piece at a time, and that's all fine and great. However, as things change over time, you find yourselves the top part of your iceberg drifting without the bottom part. So you might find yourself building stuff over here or over here, but you don't give your development teams enough time to actually shore up the foundation underneath it. So, to use a different analogy, if you ever come into a project that has this constant iteration, constant changing, just to help the users out without giving time to support the base tier, what you're going to find is, in a house analogy, you come into somebody's house and there's a toilet sitting there in the living room. It's like, what the hell is the toilet doing here? Well, originally that was supposed to be a bathroom. So that kind of stuff doesn't work in construction and it doesn't work in software. It's just easier to hide, and that sucks. Okay, so let's talk about another reason why software sucks. So when you're building software, you got this concept of 80-20. So 80% of the software takes 20% of the time, and 20% of the software takes 80% of the time. We've all heard about the 80-20 rule and all of its different iterations and usages. But when you're building software, when you're a software developer, you're putting systems together, you can build this perfect system. And it's so elegant, and everything kind of flows together, it fits together, and the business says, oh, this is fantastic. It does everything it's supposed to do. And that's just an awesome piece of software. Everybody loves it. And then comes in, and that's going to handle 80% of the case. Then comes in that dreaded 20% where you've got people say, well, what about this one scenario? Or what about this thing? So inevitably, you start to build like one-offs. Every time you build a one-off in the application, where the flow of the application used to go nice and steady and fluid, now you've got unless it's this customer, we do this kind of thing. Or in case we do this, it's this kind of thing. And these one-offs start piling on top of each other. And before you know it, and if the system's not built properly, and the people building the contracts, doing on the business side, can't figure out what their one process is, how they want to do things, they're not keeping it simple. And the old adage of keep it simple, stupid, the KISS principle is true in software probably more than anywhere else. Because if you're not keeping things simple, you're building in complexity in your processes and your software becomes unmaintainable, and eventually it collapses, and you got to scrap the whole thing and restart, and that sucks. All right, what are some other problems with software development? So one of the biggest things that happens whenever you're putting new systems together is that the business side, or the people with the requirements of what they need to build, get into solution mode. So what they'll start doing even before they talk to their development teams is they'll start saying, well, in order to do this, we need to do this, this, and this, and this. And I envision this being a button here and all these fields here. And before you know it, they're basically giving the orders down to the software development team. And the software guys, on their hand, are dealing with a business unit or whatever that's saying they become order takers. It's like, well, I don't know why they need this. I don't know what this really does, but they said they need these 100 things done. So what happens when you have this really just lack of team behind both working on both the business side and the solution side is that you get really missing understanding what the real need is. So what the business folks need to do is not really get into solution mode, really talk about what they need to accomplish and most importantly, why they need to accomplish it. Because 9 times out of 10, there's an easier way to do it. And that's kind of goes back to that principle about keeping things as simple as possible. If you're not keeping things simple, you are increasing the chances of your failure rate. And if the business side is envisioning what they see the solution being, even though there might be a much easier way that the developers could come up with that they just don't think about, they end up making it much more complex. And on the other side, if the developers don't push back and say, well, why are you doing this? Why do you need to do that? They're also losing an opportunity to remove complexity and offer better solutions for their product. And if you don't do that, it's going to kill your project and you're not going to have the best solution you possibly can. And that sucks. All right, let's put a bow on it. Let's talk about teamwork. So I've talked a lot about the business side and the software side or the engineering side and how bringing these teams together is where really the magic starts happening. So how does this actually happen? So some of the problems I've seen over my career is around the business giving too much leverage or power over to the engineering team. So they'll go to the engineering team and say, we really want to do this. And it could be an ego issue. It could be maybe there is a software issue. They'll say, no, you can't do that. And the business will say, okay, well, I guess the software doesn't work that way. They're smarter than I am. And quite frankly, that's bullshit. So software engineers are skilled, they know what they're doing, but they also do have egos, and just because you have an ego doesn't mean you're smarter than the other person around, doesn't mean anything. The business side is full of brilliant people who do brilliant things and do things that the software engineer people can't do, quite frankly, and vice versa. So when these teams come together and they solution things together, that's where the real beauty, the real magic happens in software development. So kind of if you're on the business side and you're talking to one of your engineering teams and they say, no, you can't do this, and they can't explain to you why it won't work in the software, or they talk over your head, run and find a different development partner. And at the same time, if you're on the engineering side and you think the business request is just crazy, don't talk under your breath and say, God, that guy's an idiot. I can't believe the business people are so dumb, because they're not. And you're not that smart. So there's probably a reason why they want to do it, even if they're not explaining it correctly in the conversation. So take your time, see both sides, understand, work together, and make awesome software.